Uh, it gives me a very real but sort of somewhat odd pleasure to introduce Parveen in a cellar or something. I hope the lecture's good but not too good. Parveen's going to speak about Bruce Nauman. Parveen runs the Unit 4 and the graduate program in Psychoanalysis at Brunel University, which increasingly involves a study of the image. And her work over the last decade on the relationship between psychoanalysis and the image was published last year in a book, The Emptiness of the Image. Before that, she had in the late 70s co-founded and co-edited for its life the theoretical feminist journal MF, which was significant for its introduction into English and Anglo-American culture, Lacanian speculation on the nature of sexuality, of femininity, and indeed of the category of representation. The journal ran for nearly 10 years and was collected by an edition of some pieces from it were collected by MIT Press at the beginning of the 90s in a volume entitled The Woman in Question. So, as I say, it is a real, if odd, pleasure to welcome Parveen.
You have one title for this evening, but I'd like to begin by giving you a second one. I think this talk might have been called Bruce Nauman and the Object of Anxiety. This title doesn't supersede the first one, but it introduces the indispensable, for my work, indispensable Lacanian concept of the object. So what do I do with Lacanian theory? I don't analyze the meaning of the work, and I don't analyze the artist. What I am trying to analyze is the effect of the work on the viewer. In relation to Nauman's work, these effects can be summarized, I think, in an idea of equilibrium. And this helps me to avoid using theory as a grid with which to read off an analysis of a work. The term equilibrium isn't a Lacanian one, and it isn't one that Nauman uses either. But I relate the term both to Lacanian theory and to what Nauman does say about his work. It seems to me that the theory, what the artist says about the work itself, and what I say about it must meet convincingly. So I would like to begin asking you to keep in mind this new title, Bruce Nauman and the Object of Anxiety. I know what it is to desire. I do not suffer anxiety because I am waiting for the object of my desire. I face two alternatives, triumph and failure. Of course, neither of these is actually true, since the object of desire is always a substitute for another object. Nonetheless, that is the phenomenological state desire finds me in. What is true is that lack lies behind the metonymy of desire. So any analysis of desire into the image must take into account the lack behind the plenitude and pleasure of the image. But we must appreciate the complexities of the idea of lack. For if desire results from the lack of an object, we have two possibilities. First, that the lacking object lies somewhere in front of us. Second, that the lacking object lies behind us. Lacan's objet petit a lies behind desire. It is the cause of desire. And it is this lacking object that we deal with in Nauman. Now, the idea of the object of desire does not help me to understand this idea of cause. I come closer to the idea of Lacan's object through the object of anxiety. the object of anxiety, which is outside me, nonetheless bears the most intimate relation to me. But through the process by which I become a subject, I lose myself as object. Something of the identity of my body prior to this separation from myself, I transfer into the place of the other. These objects that I displace in becoming the barred subject of language have never had any objective status. These objects are not shareable or exchangeable. It is these displacements that, at one and the same time, constitute the fundamental lack of the object, as well as the many forms of the object: breast, feces, phallus, gaze, and voice. But why do I speak of objects of anxiety? It's quite simple. When the object approaches me, and that is what the uncanny is, the approach of the object, I am threatened in my status as subject. Anxiety describes a relation of overpowering proximity to the object, within which the object is still curiously ill-defined. It is certain that it is too close to me, that it is sitting on my chest, that it is gripping my insides. What is not certain is what it is, to the point that I can say that the effect it is having on me is a function of not knowing what it is. In anxiety, I am threatened with extinction. I do not have sufficient space to breathe. In uncanny situations, then, the object devours my space as subject. But as a subject surviving everyday life, I do have sufficient space to breathe. It is, however, in everyday life, a space shared with other subjects similar to myself. So it is a space that is not my own, and I am not particularly mobile. Do I have any other alternative? Is there a space where I can have some freedom of movement? A space where I can be? Let us allow Don Giovanni to help us here. Is the third act of Mozart's opera not about anxiety and freedom? The heroism of opposing anxiety does not lie in resolving it, but rather in contempt for it. The figure of Don Giovanni in the last act of the opera is such, and well contrasted with Leporello, who is ready to expire with anxiety. Far from turning away from the object in anxiety or in heroism, the Don directly confronts the figure of anxiety to secure his freedom. He refuses the commendatory's dread demand that he repent. The spatial freedom which the Don gains in refusing the commendatory's command condemns the opera to attempt to represent a space of hell. Within my mind is fixed another image of the space that opens for the Don. It comes from a Covent Garden production about 15 years ago. The image of Ruggiero Raimondi's descent down a long flight of stairs in the best Douglas Fairbanks tradition. This is not flight in fear. This is flying. But it is high time I introduced Bruce Nauman in this talk. I think that Nauman not only works around the object of anxiety, but that he allows us a space and a time to be. While producing effects of unease through the approach of the object, Nauman at the same time allows the object to shift from its place to open up a space where I can be. I will analyze how these effects come about in the field of vision by distinguishing psychical space from perspectival space in Nauman's installations. I went to the large Bruce Nauman retrospective at MoMA in New York in 1995. There was the early work of the 60s on the lower floor, the surprise of From Hand to Mouth and of Henry Moore Bound to Fail, the daring of neon templates of the left half of my body taken at 10-inch intervals, and much more. But it was not until I got to the top of the escalator and onto the first floor that it hit me. It knocked me out. There was nothing to see as yet, but I was assaulted by the blare of screaming, tortured sounds, the harsh recitations of orders, the frenzied jangle of rock music, and if I am not mistaken, the grinding and squeaking of a carousel as it rotated, dragging the feet of its taxiderm passengers along the floor. I could not believe my ears. The cacophony made me apprehensive about what I was to see, for nothing had prepared me for Nauman's installations of the 80s. I saw the neon mean clown welcome, the stacked video monitors of violent incident, the separate scenes of clown torture, the steel and aluminium animals of carousel. Hanging just in front of my eyes, the foam and wax animal forms of the untitled but titled Two Wolves and Two Deer. Then from the 90s, the decapitated wax head and shadow mime of shit in your hat, head on a chair. The technicolor wax horror of the 10 heads circle up and down, bobbing in midair. Now, I couldn't believe my eyes. Joel, could I have the first 11 slides, please? They can just go on, one after the other. I returned to London and straightway bought the catalogue Raisonné. Working with it, I began to appreciate Nauman's concern over 3 decades with the effects of what he calls activity. This activity is to be found in Nauman's own performances, in his use of actors like Tony and Elka, who carry out his instructions to sink into the floor or rise above it, and in his corridor installations, which turn the viewer into performer. More importantly, this activity is also to be found within some of the installations. I will explain what I mean. Joel, can you just run through them? The most striking example being a piece from 1994 called Work, which was recently on loan from the Frolic to the Tate Gallery. This has a familiar feature of Nauman's work. 2 monitors, one above the other, one showing an image right side up, the other showing the same image upside down. In this case, it is a frantic image, and I mean a frantic image, of Nauman jumping up and down and rapidly repeating the word work. The activity is generated in the movement of the 2 images in relation to each other. Nauman's own activity is quantitatively and qualitatively transformed as his image begins to swing in a reverse direction. I will call this activity movement only when it issues from the piece. But note that this movement in the field of the installation overrides the habitual function of movement in the viewer's perception. I will say more about this later. My overarching aim and argument, however, is to introduce the idea, okay, can we just stay on that, of equilibrium. This idea isn't just a concern with the range of suspended pieces, from the chairs in their circular diamond or square frames to the 2 wolves and 2 deer I have already mentioned. Rather, my concern with equilibrium comes precisely from those pieces which exhibit a frantic activity. It may sound paradoxical, but I want to argue that all the activity in its different forms is in the service of a point of equilibrium for the spectator. There is an early example of Nauman's attempt at a new kind of equilibrium, though it fails. This doesn't stop the frequent reproduction of the famous photograph, Failing to Levitate, in my studio from 1966. So what is so important about Nauman trying to levitate? It's like trying to float, but the medium isn't right. And when 7 years later, Narman encourages a horizontal Elka and Tony to try to raise themselves above the floor or sink into it, he departs from the usual relation to the support. In between, there is the hour-long performance at the Whitney Museum with his wife and with Meredith Monk, bouncing in the corner, which involved leaning back at nearly a 30-degree angle and breaking the fall by slapping hands against the wall. Dan Graham called it playing the architecture. I would call it playing space. Nauman seems to want to displace the body's relation to the vertical and the horizontal. Floating in water wouldn't achieve this. Floating in air would, if he could. It reminds me of the infant described in Paul Shielder's 1939 article, Clinging and Equilibrium. The infant can defy gravity by the strength of its grasp. The newborn can suspend itself by its grasp. Shielder's point is that while it clings to the mother, the infant sucks, and this secures the infant's equilibrium. Sucking and clinging, a masterful suspension, we might say, constitute an equilibrium in the field of an infantile organization of space. Later, the infant's clinging works quite differently. It helps to attain and preserve an upright posture. This is an adult organization of space and mastery of gravity. The former is predominantly libidinal. The latter has more to do with the evolutionary demands of postural independence. I am talking about establishing an equilibrium different from both that which is a fusion with the mother's body and from that which is a conquest of gravity. There is activity and mastery in each of these two organizations of equilibrium and space. Now, the necessity for independence from the mother is obvious. But why should we have a further need, that of a respite from postural independence? It is not so much that we want not to be upright, and certainly we do not invite passivity. What we need is respite from an entire system of seeing and space which is bound up with mastery and identity. To see differently, albeit for a moment, allows us to see anew. If levitation does not come to Nauman's aid, there are other powerful and successful sources of equilibrium in his work. The stacked monitor screens. Let's return to the 1994 piece work, and I'm just going to give you a description of this. It's the next piece that I will actually analyze in detail. There is Nauman's head on the upper screen moving up and down. This is the piece work from the Fröhlich, repeating the word work with dogged determination. And on the lower screen is the same image upside down. The first impression on coming across the piece is that of a circular force which comes out from the surface of the screen in a powerful rotation and which passes back through the surface of the screen to a point behind it, and then repeats the cycle over and over. You stand there winded. You are transfixed and disbelieving. The head starts to transform. What is happening to this strange body part? Is it one or two? Is it being tortured in some unimaginable way? Sometimes the top screen is empty for a moment, as though the head had drowned or been swallowed up. Sometimes the head flips over and reappears underneath, and this happens in the other direction also. There are changes in the rhythm both of images and of the spoken word. For any word repeated over and over again will be successively deformed and reformed in myriad ways. Since the two images do not always line up, the joint images undergo a succession of topological transformations. Imagine a neck joining the two heads and being stretched and twisted. Imagine the two heads uncomfortably inhabiting the same plane. Imagine the shrunken heads telescoped around the central frame. And then it seems they have smashed their heads into nothing. There is joining up, a disappearing, and a splitting. What perceptual calculations might we be making? That when the head on the lower screen appears on the upper, either we now see the face which must have been on the back of the head all along, or that the upside-down head is annihilated by the upright head on the upper screen. There is all the violence of movement. And if there is violence as Nauman is hurled around, the violence is even more palpable as the movement which hurls the spectator out of the picture. The movements on the screen have the effect of blows on us. They fend us off again and again. That stops us from being part of the picture. You will see in detail with my next example how this effect is achieved. With all this commotion, where, you might ask, is the equilibrium? It has to do precisely with the rotation around the join of the monitors. Rotation suggests equilibrium. It is the action engendered by the installation that itself installs equilibrium. We are at the 0 point between opposites, between arrest and motion, between right side up and upside down, between back and front, between appearing and disappearing, between violence and submission. I want to discuss the next example of movement in more detail. Anthrosocio, Rinder spinning. It's a complex installation with many video projectors, color video monitors, video disc players, and video discs. It was first shown in 1992 in Documenta. It is very similar to Anthrosocio, Rinder facing camera of 1991. Could we have the next slide, please? This is the Rinder facing. And then could we have the next one, and we'll stay with the next one. This is Anthrosocio, Rinder spinning. Let me describe Rinder spinning. Rinder Eckert, a performance artist and trained singer, chants sets of 3 phrases continuously and hypnotically. Feed me, eat me, anthropology. Help me, hurt me, sociology. Feed me, help me, eat me, hurt me. I'm not offering any explanation of these. There are floor-to-ceiling wall projections of Rinder's revolving head, upside down and right side up, as he turns on an unseen swivel chair. These images are also on the video monitors, which are played non-synchronously and at a high volume. So there is a barrage of images and sounds. Even with just a photograph of the installation, what is compelling is a sense of decapitation. It isn't just that the heads are cut off at the top and around the chin. There is a quality about them that suggests something of the statue that moves, of the dead coming alive. It is interesting that the year before, Nauman made 4 pairs of heads in wax, and that one of them was Reinder's. Nauman's wax heads are quite uncanny, as you saw from details of 10 heads circle in and out. But the effects of this installation take us beyond the uncanny. So far, I have described it as a 0 point between the inert and the mobile, the live and the dead. Here is a wheeling head, an acrobatic cripple, a spectral heavyweight. Now I must be more precise about the nature and the effects of movement and equilibrium in this work. I indicated at the beginning that a distinction can be made between the movement in the field of the installation and the habitual function of movement in perception. It will help to use Fenichel's 1937 paper, The Scopophilic Instinct and Identification. Though it is much to say about the developmental aspect of movement and perception, I want only to use one example from this paper to contrast it with Reinder's spinning. The example concerns a female patient who had had a childhood fear of a picture cylinder. Fenichel calls it a wheel of life, a sort of embryo cinema. I quote, "It was in the form of a revolving cylinder divided into sections in which one placed sheets of paper, or pictures. If one looked at these as they revolved through the different sections, the successive positions assumed by the pictures gave them the appearance of being in continuous motion, and also made them look like solid figures. She had a feeling," as the patient, "that the pictures were jumping into her head." For the patient, there is a pleasure and activity in looking on the model of oral introjection. But at the same time, she experiences the threat that her eyes would be pierced. We are dealing with the libidinous looking, and clearly it has its own terrors. What happens to us as Reinder's wheeling head travels along the walls? We could say that the movement of Reinder's image is like the picture cylinder, dead things coming alive through movement. The wheeling head hurtles along its set trajectory, the head turns on its axis, and the turning heads are laid out in a giant turn around the walls. Yet we are not in danger. Reinder's image will not descend from the walls and cross the floor to get us. Reinder's swiveling chair takes him round and round the room, but the focus is not on solidity and continuity as it is with Fenichel's wheel. Rather, it is on the spectral head and on the crippled revolutions of a swiveling seat. As the images take up the relay one from the other, the picture remains inviolate. There is, however, a sense of violence. The movement of the image kicks us out of the picture. We disappear into the empty space of the circular track without a finishing line. Reinder's head rides its solitary circuit. Perhaps this is not so much the violence of movement as the violence of the uncoupling of the spectator from the scene. In kicking us out of the picture, Nauman has unraveled perspectival space. We are speaking of the creation of distance, of a non-continuous space between the viewer and the scene. This is a distance that cannot be reduced. We cannot fill in the gap that intervenes between us and Reinder spinning. How is this done? I think the answer has to be by movement which is not directional. The movement balances itself. We have equilibrium because we can assign no direction to what's happening. It doesn't take off in any direction. And that is why there is an unbridgeable distance. It's happening out there and it can't come toward you, unlike the figures of the Wheel of Life for Fenichel's patient. This is true, though the room is everywhere peopled with heads. There is Reinder's head, the profile and the back of his head, all at times right way up and at times upside down. And again, as a memory in the mind's eye, the video monitors display the head upside down on top and right side up underneath. But the change in scale does not affect the lack of direction. Instead of direction, there is circularity and a separation of the viewer from the view. I referred earlier to the equilibrium of the grasping child and of the upright citizen. So where are we now? What does it mean to say that we are no longer connected to the scene in front of us? Obviously, this seeing is not libidinal as it was for Ferichel's patient. The taking in through the eyes has lost its incorporative force. Distance is the opposite of incorporation. But neither is this seeing rooted in perspectival space. For that you would need to be able to wind a thread through the scene, through a continuous space. A gap puts paid to that idea. Everyday seeing, whether that of child or adult, whether desiring or detached, usually covers the gap. With Rinder spinning in his orbit and the viewer knocked out of his, this changes. It seems that the circular plane of movement is important. It is not a movement that approaches and recedes from the viewer. The circularity can vary considerably across Nauman's works. Work traces the profile of a circle. In Rinder, the circle traces an arc around the viewer. In Carousel, the circle is traced out flat in front of us. Equilibrium, in the sense I have been discussing it, is tantamount to the collapse of the viewer's shared subjectivity. I call it shared because what is usually called subjectivity is forged in the social. My argument is that this happens through a break in perspectival seeing, of which Rinder spinning is a particular example. There are other examples in Nauman, numerous corridor installations and 2 floating rooms. And a discussion of these should make clear the interrelation between perspective and shared subjectivity. Appalling piece of drawing by me. Nauman himself often speaks of these corridor works in terms of the distinction between the public and the private. I disagree with this description. I think my disagreement is terminological and theoretical. The public-private distinction is a public one. What is private is constructed firmly within the public sphere. That very private thing, your subjectivity, is after all social. We need another term to contrast with the private-public couple. My term is equilibrium. And my account of equilibrium is informed by the way Lacanian psychoanalysis thinks of space. Nauman talks of private space as the opposite pole to public space. But my argument is that in his work, he takes us beyond this opposition. So what I've tried to draw you here is a very complex corridor installation. It's the Nick Wilder installation from 1970. And you really need to get some of the dimensions of this installation in your head to follow what I'm going to say. So I will try and work through the 6 corridors that there are. Those lines which I got tired of drawing suggest that the corridors are dark. So when there are lines, there wasn't light, and when there aren't lines, there was light. There are 6 corridors, and they're of unequal width, and you can see at the bottom that some of them are too narrow for you to enter. They are all 32 feet long. The first corridor, starting from the left, is too narrow to enter. It is 8 inches wide, and it has an oscillating camera in a partially concealed room off one end. This camera feeds into some of the monitors on display in the other corridors and shows the room's upper walls and ceiling. The second corridor is 23 inches wide and is lit by gallery ceiling fixtures. There is a camera mounted high just inside the entrance, and I'm sorry, I've actually forgotten to put it in full. Mounted very high up. And there are 2 stacked monitors on the floor at the far end, one showing the back of the viewer advancing down the corridor from the camera that is high up at the entrance, the other showing the corridor empty. The third corridor is 12 inches wide and is unlit. The fourth corridor is 35 inches wide and is unlit. It has a single monitor on the floor at the far end showing images from the oscillating camera in the first room. It also has a camera mounted high and on its side at the far end, which produces an image on a monitor in the next and 5th corridor. That's the 60 inches one. On turning the corner and entering this 5th corridor, one can see on the upper monitor a fleeting image of one's back presented sideways. The illusion is of a body falling down off the screen instead of turning a corner. which is what the camera is actually picking up. Then one sees other people in the previous corridor on this upper monitor. On the lower monitor, there is another live feed from the concealed room. The sixth corridor is 4 inches wide and unlit. Nauman has said that the corridor pieces are about the connection between public and private, and that and I quote, "the video helps the private part, even though it is a public situation. The way you watch television is a private kind of experience." But are things so straightforward? In what sense is the image on the monitor screen private, or for that matter, public? How can we get a grasp on this? Perhaps through pursuing something that the installation itself suggests and plays with, acts of surveillance. Michel Foucault's panopticon model of modern subjectivity relies not only on surveillance by the observer hidden in Bentham's central tower, but on the internalization of that surveillance by the observed. It is important that we note that this affects the way in which we, the modern subject, sees. Nauman makes us see differently by disrupting the visual organization of surveillance. He interferes in the internalization of surveillance by interfering with our perceptual expectations. He exploits the visual rift between watching oneself and oneself being watched. He actualizes the impossible. I see myself from the point from which you see me. I find that the space of internalization of surveillance does not neatly map onto the dimensions of surveillance. Nauman's video images have the function of intrusion, but it is not the intrusion of the public into the retreat of the private. It is an intrusion into the system of public and private. Something intrudes through the monitor screen when you are in the second corridor. It is yourself, but you are somewhat unfamiliar. You might know that you are seeing yourself, but you don't recognize the representation of the movements you made in space. Here you are, walking towards the screen. Instead of seeing yourself approaching, you see your back retreating. And instead of getting nearer, you seem to get further away. That's on one monitor. On the other monitor is only the empty corridor. So you're walking towards the screen, but you're not seeing yourself at all. You are there, but the corridor is empty. After all this, you go down the fourth corridor in the dark. And on the monitor, at the other end, are the upper walls and ceiling of the concealed room off the first corridor. You haven't been in it, and you haven't seen it. It has little to do with your presence in the fourth corridor. Is this a picture such as there might be on any television screen, some other place? And then you turn the corner into the next corridor, and the camera placed up high, now behind you, remains trained on you. And at the far end of the fifth corridor, on a monitor, you see a body fall off the screen. And on the second monitor, the image of some other place again. So the viewer in the installation sees himself in unfamiliar ways, through the eyes of someone viewing him. The viewer is in two places at once, which is, of course, where he never is in everyday life. Thus, the experience of watching the monitors yields a sense of being split by the screen. It also yields a sense of falling off the screen before the viewer is restored to more customary views of a body in space. These experiences change the viewer in the corridor. They momentarily relieve the subject of its shared subjectivity by exposing the structure of the subject of surveillance. They effect a fleeting disappearance of the viewing subject. How can we understand the breaking down of the usual correlations of sight and space in terms of their psychical effect? We need Lacan's idea of the gaze here. The gaze is the object that pins our perceptions in place. When Narman tampers with the places involved in perception, he dislocates the gaze. It leaves its place and reveals its usual function of dissembling. Let me explain the Lacanian idea of the subject of perspective. It is a subject of representation split off from its object. The operation of perspective produces the object as a hidden object. Lacan, writing about perspective, has shown how the visual structure of the world is organized not around an object, but around a whole. Something remains impossible to represent. Lacan argues that in perspectival representation, the projections of the anterior and posterior horizons onto a picture plane don't meet. In this way, we have a whole whose edges have to be stitched up to define the horizon point. When the whole of the visible world is projected, that is the space in front of and behind the subject, there is the gap that you cannot see between the anterior and posterior horizons. The complexities of perspective are like the making of tucks and seams. Lacan has argued that the modern subject is a subject of perspective, and perhaps we can connect this to the question of the public and the private via the idea of surveillance. You need clean, straight lines of sight for surveillance. Nothing must block the view. In the Nick Wilder installation, the viewer himself blocks the view. The viewer might have expected a picture at the corridor's end, or an opening perhaps, instead of which there is its own impossibly shrinking back in front of it. The object gaze shifts from its place. Nauman shatters the internalization of surveillance by undermining the system of vision it relies on. The success of surveillance depends on the idea of a public space, which is a deprivation of and incursion into a private space. In reality, the success of surveillance depends on self-surveillance. And of course, there is nothing private about that. Public and private don't meet in the viewer. Psychoanalytically speaking, the public enters the subject in the internalized form of the superego. Subjectivity is public. What Narman calls private, I describe as the loss of shared subjectivity. There are moments in the installation where the appearance of the viewer's body on the monitor precisely constitutes the viewer's disappearance as subject. With the body split in two or falling off the screen, the body becomes a stain in the picture which disrupts the completeness of the visual field. For a moment, there is no subjective vision. Let me give another example of this moment of blindness. Castle Corridor, elliptical space from 1971, is a curved corridor, only 4 inches at either end, with an entrance through a door on the concave side, in the middle. The viewer is to be given the key for an hour and is free to leave and return during that time, but is not to share the space with anyone else. People can look in through the 4-inch ends, but there is a place near the door which cannot be seen. Nauman supposes the viewer to be going through the artist's experience of sharing, yet withholding something. This explanation seems to me too metaphorical, whereas the work itself suggests something rather odder. The viewer has made himself invisible. He can no longer be watched by the multitude of visitors to the exhibition. The situation reminds me of those games which set off a delicious excitement in children, which precisely consist of you with your eyes closed, awaiting exposure. It is you who can't watch and therefore can't see. What lies behind the expectancy of that childhood moment of hiding? You will shudder with pleasure when other eyes find you out. But the moment before, unseen and unseeing, where were you? I think there must be such a blind moment in the castle corridor at its center near the door. But now it is the point of the experience that you say, stay hidden, perhaps till your hour is up, till you know, to echo Nauman, that the public doesn't care. And then you return to the order of surveillance. What happens in that space of time? The game could go horribly wrong. The deliciousness of the moment of waiting could wear off. Anxiety could set in with the question, does the other want to lose me? The child is released precisely from an enjoyment that could become unbearable on being discovered and finding that he has a place in the desire of the other. Yet Nauman does not expect the adult viewer to be anxious. Perhaps because of the freedom to come in and out, and perhaps because there is an overall time limit to the solitary condition, the 1 hour after which you relinquish the key and re-enter the public domain. What then are the effects of being in a place not to be seen or seeing, a place where nobody cares? Reduced visual stimuli, silence, and reduced movement. Do you get anxious like the child would, or do you enjoy hiding in the pouch of perspective with no place in the visual and the social? Could I have the last slide, please? You might agree that I have made an argument about the breakdown of perspectival space in the corridors, but what has happened to the idea of equilibrium? My next example links equilibrium and safety, which for Nauman is what is at stake in the public-private distinction. Nauman has made explicit that the other, the public, poses a threat. It is safety that is at stake in floating room, lit from inside. Floating room is a brightly lit room installed so that its center is above the body's center, giving a sense of levitation, something that Nauman had tried independently, as we know. And the roomer also appears to float. Safety is linked to the contrast of light within and dark without. Narman says, the more time you spent in the room, the harder it was to think about leaving. It became much safer to stay in the center of the room, because you became anxious about the dark space outside of it. So we have a link between levitation and safety. Perhaps Nauman would say that both belong to the side of what he calls the private. At any rate, Van Bruggen tells us that he compares the experience, and I quote, to the dilemma of a child who is lying in bed and drops an arm over the edge. Withdrawing the arm may stir up something unknown under the bed that can grab it. But it is too scary to jump and run out of the room into the dark. The only way out is to slowly withdraw the arm and wait comfortably within the safe middle of the bed until the sun rises. We've all had this experience, and if the child is comfortable, it is because it has found a new equilibrium whereby its body is out of reach. I myself don't remember anything but an apprehensive tightening of muscles. I could not put my body elsewhere. The viewer in the lit room can be comfortable, not because there is light, but because there is a centering. Here are the instructions for the installation. We are trying to get to the center of some place, that is exactly halfway between each pair of parts. We want to move our center to coincide with such a point. We want to superimpose our center of gravity on this point. Save enough energy and concentration to reverse. And then in brackets, the instructions say the center of most places is above eye level. There is an initial anxiety produced by the room, where Nauman claims the space inside the lit room floats to the outside where it is dark. The attempt to find a center takes you out of the space of anxiety. The centering is a new equilibrium. This is the opposite of the frightened child who shrinks into himself. To be safe from public others, one needs a different sense of one's center, a different relation to gravity. Levitation is not really the answer. Nauman failed to levitate in his studio. But Nauman does effect a different relation to gravity, to space, and to the public through an activity on the spectator's part, which leads to a new equilibrium. Perhaps we can take the center of ourselves and levitation and the private and the unseen space in the bend in the corridor as Nauman's ways of talking about the space he opens in his installations, moments of freedom from our public and private selves. I hope that you have returned from time to time in this paper to the ideas of anxiety and freedom that I put to you at the beginning. I now want to end with some remarks on the relation of anxiety and freedom in Rinder spinning. It seems to me that while the movement internal to Rinder spinning is crucial in the production of the uncanny effect, at the same time the organization of that movement also explains the resistance that the installation mobilizes against the uncanny. How does one identify the uncanny? While there is more to it than a checklist of items, certain features outlined by Freud often help in the identification. Both in Rinder and in work, there is a dismemberment and a doubling. There is also a repetition that carries all the force of the compulsion to repeat. You may recognize this phrase in its relation to the Freudian death drive, the beyond of the pleasure principle. There is something that doesn't satisfy the pleasure principle and which insists and disrupts it. But how is the analog of such an insistence produced in the field of the image? I don't think that repetition in and of itself, something happening again and again, suffices to produce the uncanny. The repetition has to have the force of a powerful and independent activity. I tried to show how the movement in Rinder spinning was self-contained and quite outside the spectator. I think we can now take this to be a description of a case of the compulsion to repeat. Of course, it is in the repetition that the object approaches and that the uncanny effect is obtained. But this particular mechanism of repetition also produces a distance from the scene. It seems then that the compulsion to repeat operates in the same moment as that of the kicking of the spectator out of the picture. If this is so, am I saying something inconsistent? For on the one hand, I am arguing that the installation provokes all the disquieting insistence of the uncanny, and on the other, that the very same mechanism produces the viewer's equilibrium. We are talking about the difference between the uncanny presence of the object and the empty place it vacates. So here is an uncanny that doesn't threaten in the last instance. I think that Nauman works in different ways in different installations to similar effect, and that the very work that he puts into the production of the uncanny effect enables not only the approach of the object which occupies your space, but also the opening out of that space. In his paper on the uncanny, Freud insisted on its relevance to the field of aesthetics, finding himself barely able to conjure up examples of uncanny experience from life. And it remains unclear from the welter of arguments that arise from Freud's attempts to track down the uncanny what exactly it is. Where better than in Nauman's work to study the artistic conditions of production of the uncanny and its related effects. The compulsion to repeat equals the collapse of space, whereas phenomenologically we equate freedom and space. My capacity to originate, to be, requires a spatial freedom. It therefore follows that my incapacity to be free, the condemnation of me that I will not and cannot change, is equivalent to a spatial deprivation. The uncanny describes this state of affairs. And while Nauman plays with the presence of the uncanny object, he frees me from the prison where there is less space than I need, in order that I can be. You're making trouble. Well, we can have questions in the bar.
There's what about the experiment when lying on the floor he shows his wife. Why do you work with there and there and doesn't work with one? Floating on the person?
Levitating. He was trying to levitate.
Why do you work in the medium of water?
He didn't try it in the medium of water.
You say it works on air and it doesn't work in water.
No, I said that we couldn't really call it equilibrium. It was a question of floating in water, because floating in water is something that happens. I'm trying to describe and outline a new idea of equilibrium. So if he could have levitated, that would have counted, but he can't levitate. So then I go through all the different installations in which he achieves something similar, in effect.
I have a question. It concerns the relation with your argument to the virtual presence. I wonder if you're arguing the space of your freedom.
No, I'm arguing the opposite. I'm saying that the space of your freedom is there when you manage to get away from perspective, because perspective is what defines, for Lacan, the modern subject. And then a related argument was that surveillance, in a sense, defines for Michel Foucault the modern subject. And so that you are actually caught up in an entire system of vision. So what I'm trying to talk about is how you can momentarily be let off seeing as you normally see. Because I'm saying that's the only moment when you actually step outside the sphere. I don't know, but it should be one place where it doesn't exist. I mean, it's very hard to say it doesn't exist, obviously, at some simple level. It's still there. But I'm trying to say that the effects on the spectator can be argued to supersede it. I mean, clearly your eyes are still seeing what they're seeing in front of you. It's not, sorry. But what are you thinking of? Would you like to give some recent examples? Yes, but it still doesn't have to be exclusive to this. Though. I need perspective to break down in some arguable sense. I don't need to be able to explain every condition of viewing which isn't perspectival. But I would like to hear that.
Levitation's relationship to illusion is also, because illusion is a very essential study question.
But would you like to define it? I mean, how are we to understand the word illusion?
There is the part of it that's very classic, and the whole part of it element something picks up on the sound. And I wonder whether the issue of meditation comes out of that.
Well, I don't know, but it seems to me that if you take the tortured clown, again, you have a very spatially powerful installation. And when you say illusion, I'm not sure whether you would be simply subtracting the importance and effects that space produces. In an environment spinning, you could see that the monitor screens, they're not simply there for the picture, they're part of the installation. They're very much part of the installation. I'm not sure how to think about it. But the space is very striking. The minute you say illusion, I wonder what happens to the actual setup of the installation, which in the case of the clown ones, especially the tortured clown one, is very, very important. Which is why I asked you to define illusion. I'm not suggesting that the ideas don't come from here, that there aren't lots and lots of rational ways of talking about this. And I'm also not trying to disagree with Nauman. And in a sense, I'm accepting that he's doing something extraordinarily important, only I wouldn't call it private. You know, so it's not a fundamental disagreement, but it is a way of understanding that work in my own terms, just like I'm listening. Well, I mean, in a sense, that's why I gave those very, very few brief remarks at the beginning. In a sense, I'm talking about starting with the effects on me as a spectator. And then, in a sense, yes, you've got to touch base somewhere, which is why I think what the artist says is incredibly important, but I know, not for a moment do I think you have to go with it or believe it in its own terms. I mean, my last piece of work that you heard was on Orlan. I use everything she says. It's fascinating. But I don't think she knows what she's saying. When she talks about a woman-to-woman transsexualism, you know, I feel that it's okay for me to take this up and make sense of it. No, it's my method. I'm talking about my method. Yes. Well, I want to say that Nauman uses many different mechanisms, and in a sense those are some of the different mechanisms, to produce what I want to rise above this paper as an idea of equilibrium which would hold all those together. And an idea of equilibrium which at the same time means that he is moving away from the usual relation to gravity. So that's all I mean by it, in a sense. It's the access to this opening up of space. And then the examples are so many very different ways, because I do think that looking at the body of work, there seems to be something incredibly kind of centrally strong that goes through it. I mean, not every single piece, obviously, but it seems to me that the notion of equilibrium might be the first stab at getting at this element that really is maintained throughout the work, no matter how different the appearance is across decades. So you might be accusing me of not having made the idea sharp enough. You might well be right. Yes, but then what would you do with that fact? That I want to draw it into my psychoanalytic account and the notion of opening up space, which is why it doesn't matter to me that they're slightly different from each other, as long as they're all different in standard form. But yes, I suppose one could explore the finer differences.
But there's not a range of spectator relations. We use the word spectator sometimes. And it seems to me that some of the work have an image quality that people are whereas others seem to pitch I'm not saying
that might be true. Obviously, I've taken 3 or 4 examples, but I'm interested that you say exactly the opposite of what I said. You say you're pitched in, I say you're kicked out. So, no, but I mean, I don't know whether you mean to make it the opposite, turns around 180 degrees. Because in the few that I've talked about, I have actually said exactly what I said. I mean, there is this feeling of confusion, which is why I try to describe work and just leave it as a description. And I sat on a chair on my 4th visit and wrote what I saw, and that's what I saw. I mean, it sounds very unlikely, but I was actually unable to say what I was seeing. The first time I went home, I didn't remember what it was that the video consisted of. It was just Narman's head and the same work. And I couldn't remember that because the responses were so complex. The thing for producing me was so complex. So, yes, in that sense, you could say you're in the mix. But my whole analysis was there in order to argue that actually this strangeness, or whatever you want to call it, and I try to describe it, is exactly, the strength of it is exactly that it puts you out of the picture. Because in putting you out of the picture is putting you in a different space. No, you're not present to yourself, you're absent. I'm sorry, I seem to be saying the diametrical opposite to everything that everybody wants to say, but maybe that's why what the psychoanalysis is, what constitutes psychoanalytic. Because I'm saying that the subject is no more. The subject is subject of language, the subject is subject of perspective. So it can't increase your presence to yourself. You're not there. And the I mean, it wasn't accidental that I said where the I can be, because when Freud says where id is, there shall ego be, at least that's only the standard edition translation of it. Lacan's reading of that is where id was, there shall I be. And I is not your everyday subject. You look very Pascal.
Because of the relation to time and accept. Do you remember every time different lengths of time needed in different installations?
I have to confess that I squeezed it into 2 hours before I caught the plane home, not knowing how wonderful it would be. I can't answer it. I mean, I've had to work from the catalogue. I've had to try and catch up with slides, anything showing, queuing up at the, and
the question because I think because of the other question, I wonder whether that people wonder if because there are different installations, that they mean something different. I wonder whether the time until you are not anymore subject, but reach that equilibrium, the intention, say, an extension, say, take that there's different time, and that's the difference.
well, yes and no. Yes and no, because there would be different times, and then we had this idea, and you got a bit smarter. You could whip round very fast and get this effect. I mean, you know, I'm not. You see, I think one of the problems actually is when we come to the coexistence, if you like, of the uncanny and the opening up of space at the same time, right? So equilibrium on the one hand, unease on the other, which really do seem completely contradictory. I think we just have to accept that if you take everyday life or if you take the space of analysis, you will be talking about the object coming to the fore or the subject coming to the fore constantly, even if, when we talk about the end of analysis, we say that you end on the object. Nonetheless, all the time, there has been an in and out of these. So I'm not sure, in a sense, how to describe. I mean, there's a question there about the time element that links to the seeming inconsistency, and I'm not at all sure how to answer that. But it might be instantaneous. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. It would seem to me.
Perhaps the most greatest scientist is the most so that perhaps these feels like your own perspective, but these things do
it's arguable. What I would want to say is, what's the point of going to the art exhibition if it's going to do something to me? And in my terms, doing something to me would be opening that space for me. I mean, I don't know. Yes, I don't know how one finds this one out. And it seems to me that here it might be a matter of a reading. Again, if we go back to the fact that they're both there, right? There's some sense in which we could very simply, crudely say they're both there. And it's not a process that ends with one. Then the reading is what tips you one way or the other. And I think, and I do think actually that the readings ought to be as important as that it makes you then look at the thing differently. Otherwise, what on earth is one doing a reading in its turn? Well, maybe we can end by my saying there is a big time in the image conference at the end of May in which I'm giving a paper, and no doubt that I will be forced to develop this in that direction. Can I just say for those who are planning to follow it, even if they're not taking it, that tomorrow is a showing of Peeping Tom, and many of you might want to see it even if you're not following the course, because it is one of those movies. It's in the Square Room. It's in the Square Room tomorrow at 11:30, and I'll very briefly indeed, introduce it. And those who are actually following the course will get Xeroxes for the following week's discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much.